welcome to another edition of Champion Brief's video topic analysis. For this edition, we'll be covering the topic for the national tournament, which is Resolved: Radicalism is Preferable to Incrementalism to Achieve Social Justice. This is a very interesting topic because it's functionally a methodologies debate that the resolution is demanding. Usually we kind of get into that debate on a framework debate, and there isn't much of a resolutional justification for one methodology or another. This one is solely a methods debate. And Adam, today I'm joined with Adam Tomasi, one of our writers on Champions Briefs, and Adam has actually written specific articles about this topic. So let's start with kind of your opinions on the topic, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Daniel. And I'll begin by noting that I agree that this topic has like a unique methodological angle in the sense that both sides are considering the best method to achieve social justice. So these debates are largely not going to question the very notion of social justice, even though, as I argue in my framework topic analysis for the brief, that there are competing ideas about social justice, and those competing ideals are either more AF-friendly or neg-friendly. And you want to think about this from the definitional debate as well, especially when you're thinking about like what social justice is, but also what radicalism and incrementalism are. Like, you would not want to define radicalism as like the best form of complete social transformation if you're neg. Like, you want to define radicalism as being, less cool. And when you're AF, you want to define incrementalism in a way that suggests that it is a series of half measures. Whereas with the neg, you want to define incrementalism in a way that suggests it's more practical or pragmatic. So that's an aside. But in terms of the articles that I've written, I wrote an article for the Activist History Review called Complementary Tactics: Connecting Counterviolence and Militant Nonviolence. And in that article, I explore the methodological questions that the resolution examines. And I also consider how both nonviolence and violent revolution can be radical strategies, depending on historical circumstance. So that unpacks the association between radicalism and violence that a lot of negatives are going to definitely want to consider and think about. But as the AF, you don't want to feel like you're beholden to like one strategy or one ideal of what radicalism is.
Let's kind of talk about that a little bit, because I think that debate is going to be a key one here on the topic. In my reading, I found that there was a lot of kind of conflation between radicalism and extremism in some of the writing, and that radicalism on a political solutions kind of has a more specific definition than maybe what we hear in the media as being called radicals all the time. So what I found was the solid definition for radicalism, at least in my research, was that radicalism is a complete shift from the status quo. There is nothing that would resemble the status quo within a radical shift, versus maybe an extremist shift would have some kind of semblance of the status quo, but in order to get the shift that they're looking for, would always rely on the most extreme tactics possible, whereas radicalism doesn't necessarily look at violence in the same way. So I guess maybe, is there some big difference in the literature that you found through your more extensive research?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that extremism often involves some component of terrorism, in the sense of seeing terrorism as a means to accelerate a process, right? Like the way that the Weather Underground in the United States believed that in order to end the Vietnam War, and this was at a point when the war had escalated for many years, they thought that you had to bring the war home by committing acts of bombings throughout the United States. Of course, they epically failed in this attempt, but that was the premise in terms of the war is not going to end with marches or demonstrations. And those marches and demonstrations were very radical in their orientation. Like, they were a call to end American imperialism more broadly, and the war in Vietnam was an example of that. So much of the anti-war movement was calling for radical systemic change. When you look at Students for a Democratic Society, Marxist parties, etc. But the Weather Underground was extremist in the sense that they wanted to turn the dial up like 10 times what the other movements were trying to accomplish. in terms of committing acts of terrorism to accelerate that. I think another component of extremism, and this is where I would say that like groups like ISIS, for example, are extremist, is that the way that they think about their political opponents is they think about them as being worthy of extermination, in the sense of, I think radicalism does allow for like great opportunity for like deliberation and for dialogue, whereas extremism is like the people on the other side are not even human, and therefore violence would be warranted against them. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of leads me to question almost in our current like status quo deliberations, where even some of the most minuscule policy changes are met with, you know, rhetoric of like, you know, fascism and, you know, whatever. It's you know, pretty extreme language that's being proposed on what would be probably defined as incremental policies. How do we overcome that within the resolution? Is there a way for the resolution to overcome kind of our perception of a policy? Because I don't know.
I think it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because a really interesting affirmative could say that radicalism is defined by how conservative forces paint the policies or paint the strategies. So if universal childcare is actually quite incremental, but it's painted as radical by the right or by other forces, like people that just like moderates that just don't want to pay more in taxes, then this is radicalism. By the same token, I think the neg can push back against that to an extent with something like a counterplan, even though at nationals you'd want to call it more of a counter advocacy. But there's a lot of literature about radical incrementalism, of the idea that like you can have like a grand vision for social change, but incrementalism just becomes your blueprint for getting there. So it does an end run around some of the priorities of the AF. So the AF has to do a good job of defining what their blueprint for change is, and don't necessarily just want to say, well, if certain people think that it's radical to talk about like LGBT people in schools, even though that's not radical per se, but if people want to call it radical, that's what I'm defending as radicalism. That might be too limited of a position, and negs can say, I can agree with that too.
I think though my other issue with the kind of the phrasing of the resolution is, where's the bright line? Like a lot of these, like what you just described, is small incremental policies that can lead towards radical change. Like if I continually have incremental policies that meet the kind of flow from the status quo of where we're sitting at in our current like policymaking world and in our morals and values, and I can show incrementally how like there could be a radical change, I don't know how that affirms or negates on this resolution. I think there's a lot of like ambiguity for both sides to kind of take advantage of on framework with that. So I guess what we're kind of getting towards here is the definitions on this topic are really vague, and they're kind of subjective. You know, liberals tend to view gun control reform as incremental, like background checks and things like that. Ultra conservatives view gun reform in a much different light. There are liberals who view, you know, social justice on school in one way, and conservatives who view social justice in school in a completely different fashion. So I think this ambiguity on the topic, especially at a tournament like nationals, is going to make it tough. Let's talk about nationals actually for a second. I competed in nationals a long time ago in policy debate when it was still called the National Forensic League. So I'm one of those old schools that still slides into the NFL acronym every so often. But when I've been coaching, I've found that nationals is probably the hardest tournament to predict what to run. And it's one of the easiest tournaments to prep for. It's kind of like, it's one of those, you know, weird things, like you just prep two different style cases, generally speaking, for nationals, and you're really good, but it's choosing which of those style cases that becomes problematic. Traditional obviously being one of them. You have to have a traditional case at that's. But what do you think is kind of the best alternate strategy for nationals?
Yeah, I'm thinking that your idea of having like two cases for each side of different styles is definitely really good, because I'm thinking the more like niche case would be one like the Locke AC, where that provides, I think, to answer your earlier observation about the vagueness of the definitions, having an AC that defends the right to revolution makes it more clear cut in the sense of the AF is revolution, the neg is not. And revolutions are good, we need them, we should prioritize them over tinkering with the system. And then the neg can say reforms are good. But if you only have the Locke AC when you go into these debates, you could have a bunch of judges who are like, I'm not following this train of thought. Oh, revolution, that sounds really scary, right? So having a more stock AC that's like, hey, you know, like when we think about the civil rights movement and MLK's ideal of the beloved community, that's actually a very radical idea. And MLK was a radical. The grassroots pressure of the civil rights movement was radical. And it was not incrementalist. If you look at who the incrementalists were at that time in that political climate of the South in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and in the national political climate. So even though the Civil Rights Acts are perceived as like an example of like good incrementalism, right? You could say that actually the many different organizations involved in the civil rights movement, even with their focus on economic justice, were quite radical. So that's an example of a stock AC where it kind of like, it takes an intuitive example. Like judges get civil rights, at least I hope they do. And then it's like, okay, this is a good example of like radicalism being preferable to incrementalism. And I'm going to talk about other stuff like climate change, other like more tangible things. Then like, here's how Locke understood the social contract to entail a right to rebel and so on and so forth. And then, yeah, for the neg, I would take the similar train of thought, like having those two strategies.
So I think you also hit upon something really important, which is knowing your history on this topic. And being able to kind of spin what you're talking about in terms of events going on as how they were perceived historically. Like we look back at the civil rights movement now, and it's like these are incremental changes. But in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was groundbreaking. It was revolutionary. Brown versus Board of Education as a decision was revolutionary in how education was considered in this country. So there are, when we look back at things and say, oh, these aren't like giant changes, at the time they were probably huge changes, and you can extend that across a lot of different social movements. Whether it's Supreme Court decisions that grant for gay marriage, women's rights, equal rights amendment, things like that. I think there's a lot of discussion like about how revolutionary things are to the people that are kind of facing oppression, maybe, versus how we look at things, 40 years in the future, or even just now. Like the tactic that I may want may be different than a tactic of a person that is facing oppression. And so I think when we get into solvency advocates on this topic, we start to get to a really interesting question on whose voices we should be valuing. Before you talked about radical versus incrementalism in terms of like conservative ideology, because conservatives generally prefer status quo change. What are your thoughts on like a solvency advocate? Whose solution should we really be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's super important on any social justice related topic to center the voices of activists from marginalized communities. And one of the enlightening things about this topic is that people within the same communities disagree about strategy and tactics. So a really good example of that is with the LGBT liberation AC in the brief, where there are really good cards on both sides from like LGBT activists and advocates, where some look at like the Supreme Court decisions like Obergefell and are like, oh, well, clearly that was an incremental achievement for the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide, and we should keep building upon these like legal steps. Whereas there are others, like there are historians who argue that we need to go back to the radical spirit of the Gay Liberation Front, which arose from the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969. And the Gay Liberation Front had very radical, even socialist ideas like achieving truly like national health insurance, universal health care. But their argument for it was about a cultural shift. And this gets back to a more general idea that if you're arguing for radicalism versus incrementalism, you can say that radicalism is about the like broader cultural change that needs to be implemented, as well as the like legal tinkering. And then the neg can say the legal tinkering is more important. But I'll wrap up that thought by saying that what the Gay Liberation Front argued when they were talking about national health insurance was that it separates the dependence upon legally recognized marriages for health insurance, because same-sex couples could not be on their partner's health insurance because their marriages weren't recognized by the state. So if you just give everybody universal health care, you no longer normalize that like you get married to be on your partner's health care. And that's different from an incrementalist approach, which is like, don't go after the insurance companies, don't go after the like medical industrial complex, just change the marriage rules.
Yeah. So I think then that also hints towards the elephant in the room on the topic, which is kind of capitalism. We kind of write about it almost in every brief and how it kind of affects on the topic. On this one, we kind of skipped it because we've written about it so much in the brief, but I think it's a good point to talk about it here. There are dueling debates on how best to approach the inequalities that capitalism creates. You have probably the extremist Marxists, revolutionaries who are very much anti-capitalist systems. Then you probably have like social democrats and social democracies like the Nordic countries, who would probably be your incrementalist approach. I think the one thing that's interesting on this debate is you probably can't argue like cap good per se. So all of those debaters who had those big cap good blocks, those probably go away. You probably need to argue more like cap reformable, neo-lib kind prolutions to capitalism that are very popular. So some sort of like limits on income, but still allowing for private property and all sorts of stuff. But I feel like cap is going to be a big one at nationals because kind of everybody can relate to capitalism in some way, whether you're working a job, you're not working a job, whether you believe in the system of capitalism or not. There is some relation to capitalism that everybody has. And so the F and the neg worlds, I think, on this topic are pretty accessible.
Absolutely. And I think that when you're neg related to that, if the affirmative's talking about the abolition of capitalism, you want to focus a lot more as the neg on the blueprint for getting there. Like you want to use cross-ex to figure out from your opponent, like, how do you abolish capitalism? What's the process? What are the steps? If they adopt some like Leninist or Maoist version of the vanguard party that seizes state power via like a civil war, there are very valid critiques of that, especially as like a model that lends itself to authoritarian regimes. You could argue for a more democratic socialism that, borrowing from like the European tradition of social democracy, like the social democratic parties that were the socialist parties of like the late 19th, early 20th century, that they adopted a more incremental approach towards working within the state, working within the system to advance socialism and like working class mass politics. Of course, the issue with those parties is that they became like ossified. Like they got too comfortable within the political system, and then they just became like a partner of like the larger like capitalist machinery that was still operating. So it's not to say that like the neg position is like always going to be correct on that, like revolution bad, the party's good. But another thing I'm thinking about is like, if as the AF you want to argue that like cap is bad, you don't necessarily want to read an AF that's just like Lenin was right and you're just like, yeah, full Bolshevik radicalism and so on. Like the nationals is not a good pool for that. But what you can do is like going back to someone like King, you can talk about how like his socialism was informed by his recognition of like widespread poverty and economic injustice throughout the US. You can talk about Eugene Debs of the American Socialist Party, who was very radical. And in fact, like his radicalism and that of many other like early 20th century socialists inspired a lot of the ideas of the New Deal.
Yeah, I think it's really possible to argue that radicalism in general is like an achievable, or a resistance to capitalism in any form is radical. So like even limited resistance is somehow a radical resistance.
So to wrap up that point, radicalism in terms of resistance by workers and their allies against the like large like capitalist interests like bosses, corporations, and so on, has like deep American roots. And those are roots that you want to explore and talk about as examples of nonviolent mass movements, where if you're arguing against capitalism, you're not wedded to like polarizing examples of like Cuba or the USSR or anything of that nature. And by focusing on the American context, I think that also deflates a lot of potential negative objections where they're like, oh, you're anti-capitalist? Well, does that mean you support gulags? And it's like, no, of course not.
Yeah, I think there's a nice middle ground that the AF can find on a revolutionary tactic against, you know, social justice, economic issues, or economic justice, without kind of being Stalinist or, you know, Castro, you know, sympathizers. There's definitely a middle ground there that talks about, you know, social change coming from the people, and even just forms of democratic socialism being radical changes. Like you'd want to talk about healthcare in this country, you know, as you mentioned before, universal healthcare is radically different than a system that we'd have now, and yet that's not inherently anti-capitalist in every sense. It's just anti-capitalist in one market. And so like if you can prove, you know, some sort of shift away from capitalism is still a radical shift, I think again that's the bright line debate on this topic, and being able to win that you're still a radical shift from the status quo. I guess finally, you know, there are all the other justice issues that are out there. You know, there's racial justice, that is a social justice issue. There's LGBTQ justice, there's economic justice, there's environmental justice, there is, you know, women's rights and equality there, which is a social justice issue. There's a lot of intersections though between those issues, right? Capital probably exists in a lot of those issues. Race exists in a lot of those issues. Gender exists in a lot of issues. Just thinking, you know, environmental justice is probably, it, you know, crosses over with economic justice and racial justice. There's school educational justice. So the app kind of has a wide variety that they can play with. How does the neg combat this, you know, broad topic in a way? I know my strategy is usually like advantage counter plans type of thing, and, you know, being prepared on just every type of issue. But what do you think is the best strategy, considering TOC was decided on topicality? How do we feel like going forward? You know, is NSDA a good topicality tournament or not?
So I'm thinking that there can be really robust topicality debates that are weaved into the contentions, where I think if you make an effort in your contentions, especially when you're neg, to draw a clear contrast between radicalism and incrementalism, like the healthcare reform DA in the brief, that focuses on how incrementalism in the context of healthcare reform can combine a radical vision with a strategic blueprint that acknowledges that there are like a bunch of complex interests and power relations at stake, and we have to like untangle them piece by piece in order to like achieve health equity. So it suggests that like we cannot do some like immediate system change. And then when you're neg, you want to paint the AF as trying to like build Rome in a day. Whereas when you're AF, you want to paint the neg as being a half-hearted compromise with injustice. Like, oh, if we just make these minor changes, the system is fundamentally good. Or, oh, we don't want to alienate the other side, so we can only do these small things and live with that. Whereas when you're neg, you want to say, no, there's this whole school of thought about confrontational incrementalism, which is another phrase that's come up in the literature, which is like, you can be an incrementalist, but still know who your friends and enemies are. In terms of like, you're going up against the insurance companies, you're going up against big business, going up against the police and the police unions and so on. And then another thing I'd recommend for the neg and both sides in particular is related to your point about advantage counter plans is knowing the field of reforms and policy options that are debated on these issues. So when it comes to the police, defunding the police would count as radicalism to me in all of its varieties. Whereas something like standardizing body cameras would be incrementalist. Or having some rule that's like, you're not allowed to turn off your body camera when you're about to commit an act of police brutality, right? Which will happen, right? Like body cameras were rolled out as this like revolutionary change in like police citizen relations. And then it was like, oh, well, they can turn off the body camera whenever they want. Or
conveniently covering up the body camera is now a felony, things like that.
Yeah, so that would be incrementalist to say like, you can't immediately cover it up. You can't conceal your badge. Things like, we're going to have more police officers that look like the communities that they work in. That's arguably incrementalist too, since it relies on this like very gradual change in police bias in terms of like hiring new people over time. A more radical change in policing would be like, this police department is going to fundamentally change how it approaches traffic stops. Like, we are not going to have any more traffic stops where pretext and like pretextual searches are involved. So like, you can pull someone over for like not using their turn signal, but you can't then use that as a pretense to say, now I'm going to search the rest of the vehicle. Because the reality is that's done in like a very racially biased way. So that would be radical to say that just can't happen anymore.
Yeah, and I think the same kind of goes towards like prison abolition, where like prison abolition is the radical solution to all of the harms of our criminal justice system that come from imprisoning people, versus like sentencing reform and, mental health care stuff and changing how we enforce drug codes. Those are all probably more incremental reforms than they'd be radical ones. Whereas, like you were saying, changing how you operate as a police department or as a criminal justice system as a whole would be your radical reforms. And I think that probably extends over towards like the education system, where some people view like talking about LGBTQ people in the classroom as radical. Other people view it as a very just incremental thing that just puts the family that may not have been discussed in the classroom before into the classroom, and so that people are represented in the classroom. And so how it's perceived, again, is going to come back to it, because there are a lot of people who would view those reforms, even in criminal justice system that we're talking about, as being incremental, body cameras and stuff like that, as suddenly being a radical reform on the police. And so perception, I think, is always going to be key on this topic. I guess when coming to that, we get to framework debates and how we kind of, the values in this on this topic are going to be justice or equality for the most part. Morality obviously is going to be in there, but it's the criterions and the standards debate that I think is going to be very interesting. The first thing that jumped to mind for me was polls, because that's how a society deems something as being like, you can kind of view how society views it. So if it's outside the majority on society, it's probably a radical solution. If it's within the majority's opinion, it may not be a radical. What are your thoughts on framework?
Yeah, so I think that the framework debate allows us to think about like what equality or what diversity or fairness or representation even mean. Even what social justice means, because like these words are so familiar, but there are so many nuances to unpack within them. And I think that one way that the AF can use their framework to differentiate between radicalism and incrementalism is to say that like diversity and inclusion are not enough to achieve equity. In the sense that even if you have more diverse faces within an institution, that institution as a whole may be messed up and unfair for and exploitative for the very marginalized groups that are purportedly now being represented more within that system. Whereas the neg could say that it's actually like a substantial improvement to like diversify the institution from within. Like some people will say, oh, we should diversify the military. Others say resist the military, period. Right? So like radicalism versus incrementalism. But I'm thinking like more generically about like the philosophy debate. that debaters want to try to get into the literature that explores at a theoretical level. Like, what does social justice mean? What does justice require in general? What does it mean for people to possess rights, like human rights? Thinking about stuff like the social contract, because I think if you just like slap a util framework onto a case that's just about like racial justice and climate change and like women's rights and all that, that the framework isn't going to end up serving you any purpose later on in the debate. Because in a lot of debates that I've been seeing, people will just kind of use util or social contract as a placeholder. And then all the debates will just be about the contentions going forward, which is almost just like thinking about the issues of the topic just for themselves and not about the framework as a filtering mechanism. So if you can figure out a way as either AF or neg to use the framework to say like, justice as fairness, as Rawls defines it, requires so-and-so. And I contend that the only way to get past that bright line is via radicalism, or actually via incrementalism, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best strategy on the topic. You're right. Most people seem to just be defaulting to util this year on topics, or reading, the classic structural violence framework, but then reading util offense under it. I think this is a topic that actually addresses structural violence in a way that's interesting, and you can read a structural violence topic, but what does it really mean to solve for structural violence and mitigate structural violence is a debate that's not had very often. So I'm excited to see some of those debates this summer.
What I'm also really thinking about with that, when you mentioned mitigate structural violence, is I know that that's like the typical phrasing for that criterion, but if you're AF, you do not want to copy paste the mitigate structural violence standard, because the neg can say, I do that. Like, incrementalism mitigates structural violence. As the AF, you want to say the standard is eliminating structural violence.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, there's even some question though about how radical reform is in and of itself a form of structural violence. If the structure is changed to harm some people, even if it harms a minority of people, it is still a form of structural violence that occurs. Whether it creates more equality in the long run or not, it is a form of structural violence when you have structural changes that either harm someone economically or, literally physically harms them in some way. So there's like a lot of those questions on, on resistance to capitalism are violent revolutions in some way that take property from some people. And that is a form of structural violence. It's just in the form of violence that supposedly ends in greater equality. And so you'd have to argue that like the ends justify the means in that situation, because in the long run you're limiting structural violence, but you're also advocating for a form of structural violence. And so with all that, Adam, do you have any final tips for debaters going into nationals?
Yeah, so I will end this with 3 tips. I think the first is you want to go into these debates with an open mind in terms of the nationals process surprising you. Like, I think in my experience competing at nationals, I finally made it to round 10 my senior year, because prior to that, I tried to shoehorn my strategy into like, it was almost like you mentioned like the 2 case strategy on each side. I would roll into nationals with 1 case and be like, for each one. And it's like, I'm going to read this case and that's all. I'm not going to deviate. And then I wouldn't clear because the case just would not adapt well to the judges. So you want to go in there with an open mind, like let your first debate at nationals give you the realization of what this tournament is going to be like, where this is going to go, like adapt on the fly accordingly. I think, and that's what I learned like my senior year when I was finally like, oh, I get how this process works now. I'm just gonna roll with it. I think the second thing is you want to make sure that you can like ask and answer really thoughtful cross-ex questions that are predicated on topic knowledge. So you want to draw on some of the historical examples that we mentioned in the topic analysis here, and also find your own, to ultimately like show the judges that like you've reflected on this stuff really well. And I think that'll make your side more credible. And then the third and final tip that I have is, while you wade into the framework debate, don't worry about having the most like rigorous academic justification of it. Like if you're going to argue for Rawls, for instance, all you need to do is probably just like explain what he said and then give like one good reason why he had a good point of view. You don't have to do this like complex meta-ethical analysis about the veil of ignorance and why it's the best framework. You can just like elaborate on the theory and then like give like one reason to prefer. Like you don't want the judges to get bogged down in a complicated framework debate, but you don't want to reject the framework debate entirely and just be like, standards util. The standards eliminate structural violence.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those. The only thing that I would probably add is that when you're debating social justice issues, remember that there are people who are facing those issues in their everyday life. You will be debating LGBTQ issues potentially in front of LGBTQ debaters and judges. You will be debating racial justice issues in front of racial minorities. And there should be a sensitivity towards what you are discussing. And an openness, as Adam said before, to all points of views on issues, so long as those points of views are ones that seek to address the social justice issues. I don't think as a community we should be dismissive of social justice issues. And at the same time, don't get into like an oppression Olympics, right? The topic is talking about in general, how do we solve social justice issues? What is the best solution? And so if we get into this debate over it's more important to solve racial justice versus LGBTQ rights versus equal pay, that's not what the debate is asking us. The debate is asking us about a strategy in general that society should seek to address all of these issues. It's not that any one issue is more important than the other. They are all important issues, and each person who is facing those issues would say that their issue to them is the most important issue, right? So when we talk about these social justice issues, we should talk about it with sensitivity and kind of a reminder to all of us that we're seeking a good strategy for all issues, not necessarily saying one issue is more important than the other. And when we use one issue as an example, it's an example as a justification for why that strategy is the best strategy, and not that that issue is the most important issue on the board. And so with that, anything else you have, Adam?
Yeah, I would quickly add too that I really like the point that you had made about not engaging in like this really like crass kind of weighing, between groups. You also want to make sure that you don't draw like careless analogies between different groups' experiences. Like what you want to do, I think, if you do have specific like examples of marginalized communities and how they engaged with either methodology, is you want to show how like the way that they engaged can be analogous to other situations in the following way. So like when you're AF, you can talk about how the pursuit of something like defunding the police is an example of how one like systemic policy change can be a lever that then like uplifts the Black community in like a whole host of different ways. And that this analogously shows how other marginalized groups can use like one systemic change to open up a bunch of other doors. In terms of like radicalism isn't like we snap our fingers and everything changes overnight. It's figuring out where to push and figuring out what systemic change, again, opens those other doors. For incrementalism, you can talk about the past achievements, but you don't want to use the past achievements to like negate present struggles. Like you don't want to say, oh, things have progressed so much already, so like there's no need for radicalism. Like you want to say, like, here's why things progressed the way they did. Not that that progress was perfect or complete, but we have to understand why those improvements did actually happen. And you could say the reason they did was because of the incrementalist methodology, which other groups can learn from within like a respectful dialogue.
Yep. Well, I think that just about does it with our thoughts on this topic for now. And for all of us here at Champions Briefs, we wish you good luck at the national tournament, and thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching.